Hey guys, it's Josh, and welcome back to the Not So Bad Bachelor Pad, your favorite podcast for learning how to balance between being a functional adult and a raging dumpster fire. Let's be honest, some days we're all a bit of a dumpster fire. Joining us inside the Bachelor Pad today is Bev. We had a phone call maybe a few weeks back, and it was just to feel each other out. But in that moment, we both got so excited and connected so well. I think I would say that.
I would say that too. And that's why, we were like, let's find a date. Let's record together. It'll be a great conversation. So thank you for having me.
Of course, we talked about this way back in season 1, and we haven't really brought it back up since then. I think it's something that we need to delve a little deeper on, because everybody knows in the Not So Bad fam that we care about manifesting quality relationships. And it kind of goes back to something that is fundamental, something that started when we were children that we didn't even really pay attention to. And that's attachment styles. Those early bonds that we make with our family members, with our parents, with the other people we interact with, really do have lifelong impacts on us. So today, I think we're going to give you a conversation you've heard 1,000 times and a completely different perspective. So everybody sit down, get your water, because we're staying hydrated, and get ready for an amazing episode of the Not So Bad Bachelor Pad. Tell me a little bit about you. What got you into attachment styles? What was your story?
Thank you. I, came from a very personal place. I grew up in a home that was difficult. It's very chaotic. No stable frames in my home. And I knew that there were certain things that I felt inside. Like I felt very anxious and I felt very unsafe and unsure. I also had a very hard time trusting others. So I was aware of how I was feeling. It was only when I fell upon the work in attachment theory that I started to make the connections back to, okay, my emotional patterns today, my thought patterns today, these actually link back to my earliest experiences. And so I had spent my entire career working in the realm of personal development and personal growth. I was working an executive job years ago, and I retired from that. I went back to school and I certified in attachment theory because I said, this is where I need to spend my time. Mm-hmm. This is my purpose. It was so impactful for me in helping me get to a place of just understanding my mind, feeling better in my own skin, and then being able to communicate with others, because that's a byproduct of that, right? That I thought, wow, other people need to hear about this. And, at the time, there wasn't much online about it. I'm happy to see that more and more people are talking about it. So it was a personal journey that I'm now sharing with others.
That's super important, because it's not something that people talk about necessarily. Getting your second win, realizing that you're in an environment, you're in a job that you're not really passionate about, or you feel like you're not growing, you feel out of place, and then doing something about it, whether it's going back to school, transitioning to another company. A lot of people are afraid to take that first step into what could potentially be the perfect fit for them. So I just want to commend you for being bold enough to take ownership of your life.
Thank you. Yeah, it's not an easy decision. I mean, I got my master's degree back in 2006. So I have a feeling, Joshua, that I'm a smidgen older than you. I'm almost 50. So when I went back to school, I mean, it was as a mature student, right? I'd already had my kids and they were in high school. And so it was a difficult decision, but I think it's a blessing when you find your purpose. And so that's what this was for me. And it was difficult, and yet it was also an opportunity I couldn't let pass me by.
And that's the honest truth. There's just something about walking in your purpose that feels good. It feels so natural that it almost seems as all the other hardships were worth it to get here. Because sometimes that's what it takes. It's trying a few things that don't feel right to know, no, this is home.
Yeah, exactly. And it also takes like certain life experiences, right? Like, we all go through really great times and not so great times, right? And so how we fare in those moments, I mean, they tell us a lot about what it is that our strengths are and what we still need to heal. And so it's very difficult to put a mirror up to your face and go, okay, this is what I'm dealing with here. This is really, I don't like to use the term weakness, but this is where I need to strengthen. This is where I need to put my focus on. It's difficult to do that, right? Because we all have an ego.
Yeah.
We all believe that we're hitting the mark. But at some point in time, like, you have to be honest with yourself, because those that live with insecure attachment, and I know we're going to get into this, these folks are emotionally dysregulated. And they may not even realize it because they've been living so long in this emotionally dysregulated state that it's just their baseline. But there is another side to that when you actually learn how to calm down your nervous system and you're able to get out of survival mode. It feels so much better. So there's a huge prize to be won for those who actually do this work, because it really is hugely impactful in terms of how you feel about yourself, your body, being present, connecting to your emotions. And then the byproduct of that is actually having more intimate, more honest and authentic conversations with those around you.
Now, I think it's funny that some of the most important lessons that we learn or that we are faced with are things that nobody really teaches us in those early days. Attachment style, emotional intelligence, the art of listening and understanding. Nobody teaches us to do those things. They're like, hey, here's English. That's how we're all connected. That's all you need to know. And that's like, I wish it was that easy, but it's not until 10, 20, even a few decades later in life that we really start to realize that, you know what, this was an area that I struggled with. Here's why I struggled with it. And then we start to learn, educate ourselves, and then start to apply that. But I was like, for so many people, I was like, we're wasting so much of our lives that are pretty finite, unequipped. So before we get too far into some of these more advanced theories, let's take it back for people who, for some reason, may be under a rock and haven't heard of attachment styles. Can you just tell us what are the basic attachment styles that most people identify as?
Yeah, I absolutely can. And thank you for asking. And by the way, I absolutely believe that this is something that should be taught in school. This is a very basic concepts of human behavior. And understanding this and connecting to this, again, strongly correlated to your ability to emotionally regulate. And when someone is emotionally regulated, they're able to think rationally. Like, my point of view is that if people were far more emotionally regulated, we'd have far less crime, we'd have far less violence, we'd have far less, disrupted family states. We'd have, I actually think our world would be different. And so I see this as critical.
No, I agree.
Very much so. So to cover the bases here, there's two, I would say, broad categories. So when we talk about attachment styles, we have secure attachment and we have insecure attachment. Now, I'll go over them really briefly. Secure attachment refers to the attachment that a child will grow up with if they come from a home where their emotional needs were predictably, consistently met. So if a child cries, if a child is sad, if a child is angry, the caregiver, the mother, the father, could be the aunt, the grandmother, whoever's the primary caregiver, responds predictably and consistently to the child in a healthy way. So we all have emotions, right? Emotions in themselves are not bad. We tend to ascribe different meanings to emotion, like sad is good and anger is bad and joy is this. But these are made up definitions of our society. We all experience a range of emotion, right? So as a child, we're most suggestible from 0 to 5, real young ones. And so when we're interacting with a caregiver, let's say our mother, and we cry and the mother shows us love and the mother smiles and we start to learn expressions about emotions from her face. And as we get older and we start to talk and we have moments where, for example, we're angry and a child says, I'm angry. the way you handle it in that moment makes a massive difference, right? So the mother who's going to say, I understand you're angry. Tell me why. How can we work together? So the child has space to feel their emotions. They're not shamed. The mother listens, and there's a trust that's formed. So it's the trust and security and predictability that is so important in those early years. And a child then grows up feeling like, okay, I'm pretty comfortable with myself. I understand myself. I trust my instincts. I trust my emotions. And I'm comfortable with others, meaning I expect that when I have conversations with others, they will respond to me in a healthy way because that's what I've seen in my life. So attachment styles is like a set of rules that get patterned into our mind really, really young for how to give and receive love. Right? So if this child has only known love and kindness, they're going to go out into the world and that's how they're going to interact with others, right? It kind of really does make sense. So this person is going to see the world as a beautiful array of connections. And you can imagine that that type of person grows up and they behave generally in a very healthy way in relationship. Now, where we end up spending most of our time is talking about the other subset, those that are insecurely attached. Just for reference number, I've seen different statistics. It falls between 40 to 60%, depending on the study, of our society in North America that is securely attached. I generally say 50%. So half of our population is securely attached, half is insecurely attached. And again, to be clear, everyone has an attachment style. So this hits all of us. It is not a mental illness. It is not a personality disorder. It's none of those things. We all have this patterning that we absorbed early in our childhood. So if we flip to the insecure side, within the insecure attachment, there's actually a spectrum. There's subcategories. So you have the anxious preoccupied on one side. You have the dismissive avoidance on the other side of the spectrum. And somewhere in the middle, you have the fearful avoidance. Now, what's interesting about this whole group, even though they're subdivided, is that they do have one core wound that they share that is common between all three. And that is, I feel unsafe. These folks, as babies and children, did not grow up in homes where they received a healthy level of emotional attunement. Right? So we're talking about, it could have been anything from emotional neglect. It could have been that there was a form of abandonment or perceived abandonment. There could have been mental illness in the home that created chaos. There could have been one or both parents that were emotionally unavailable. And the child could have been parentified at a very young age, meaning forced to grow up a little faster to maybe care for siblings that were in the home. There could have been addictions and alcoholism. There could have been abuse. I could go on and on and on about the scenarios that could disrupt a child's sense of safety and security in their home. Now, the only thing that a child needs, especially in that 0 to 5 age range, is to feel connected and safe with their caregiver. I mean, yes, they need food, they need their diapers changed, but on an emotional level, they need to feel that safety. And when they don't feel that safety, they start to create all sorts of maladaptive mechanisms to be able to survive. They go into survival mode. Mm-hmm. I will dive into the three categories and how they're different. But like as a general sense, we have, a group of people that learned about emotional attunement and another group that didn't. Yeah. And how they appear is very different.
And I was going to say that is, you did a beautiful job of breaking down that insecure attachment style, because the simple bare bones fact of it is, you're right. Those people who are in that boat, they didn't feel safe. They were afraid.
Yeah,
you don't need a bunch of jargon or nuance. I was like, it's just that simple. We all come from different households, so it may look different from person to person, but the underlying feeling is still there. Is it's not stable. And when something's not consistent, it's impossible to prepare for it. It's like you're always getting the unknown. You don't know which mom or dad you're getting. You don't know what house you're going to be staying at, if you're going to stay in a house. And there's so many different variables that we go through those formative years that really help prime us to how we go about, we approach, we look at every situation that then follows. So I love that. And that's a great point. I never really thought of the correlation, like I said, to some of these more advanced topics that we're going to get in today, such as you were talking about the fight or flight, the survival mode. Everybody knows that you should never be in survival mode for too long. But how do you think, let's tie this into what we do best. Relationships, platonic, romantic, they're all the same. How do you think staying in survival mode may skew people's attachment to who they're friends with, or maybe who they even find attractive?
Such a big question. So, I mean, it's a great question. I'll try to parse it out. So again, these folks who are in the boat of, insecure attachment, their lens to the world is, I'm just trying to survive. And they are, as you pointed out beautifully, often in their sympathetic nervous system, which is their fight or flight. And interestingly enough, we talk a lot about fight or flight as our survival mode. There's actually 4 trauma responses. There's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And fawning means people pleasing. So what you would find is that typically, depending on which type of insecurely attached person we're talking about, they would utilize different survival mechanisms. So this really does show up very significantly in relationships, and it shows up very significantly on an individual level. We know that to stay in a chronic state of fight or flight is not good for our body. If we stay too long in that, fight or flight, is we start to shut down. We know from research, we know that we start to repress our emotions, which, because we're trying to not feel them, which means they always come out in another way, right?
Prettiest way either, yeah.
No, they just kind of come out, right? We know that we have strong evidence to suggest when we're in our sympathetic nervous system state too long, fight or flight, that this creates illnesses in the body, that this creates physical symptoms, right? We have this research. So if you constantly have a stomach ache, you constantly have a headache, your back is always hurting, your shoulders are tight, everything, we know that this is linked to stress. So commonly people will just say, I'm stressed when they are in that. And it is a stress response. And what's so interesting, Joshua, is that nature has an interesting way of dealing with this. So there are some animals that if the threat is too large, they will play dead.
Yeah, the possum.
Like a possum. Yeah. We kind of do the same thing. We don't play dead, but we disconnect to a point where we're so disassociated and we're like walking zombies. Because our system is shutting down in that way, it's trying to protect ourselves. But of course, it also means that it's depriving us of some of the beauties and joys of life. You can't feel pleasure in the same way or at all. You can't be creative, right? So, we see this in relationships, again, when there's a high degree of emotional volatility. So that means unpredictable, when one or both partners are, 1 minute they're yelling and the next minute they're making up, and the next minute, one is crying and then the next one is leaving for 3 days. And it's up and down, and you're laughing. Yeah. So this is typically behavior that we see from people who are generally insecurely attached and who have not learned in their family of origin how to regulate their nervous system. Mm-hmm. So I often use this example where I say, because we all come out of different homes, sometimes you come out of a home and you learn how to cook, right? And sometimes you come out of a home and you don't learn how to cook.
That is true.
You're reliant on Uber Eats. Okay. Or, you just wouldn't eat. And so it's a skill like anything else that you can learn. You can learn emotional regulation, but many people have just never learned it in their family of origin. And then they've lived life this long. They see it as their baseline. Like they don't even know that there's another way. If you wake up in the morning for 30 years and your anxiety is like a 7 or 8 out of 10, and like nothing's even happened yet that day and you're already revving,
Yeah.
right? If you wake up every day for 30 years, at some point you just think, well, this is just normal. Everyone else feels the same way. You don't realize that there is, in fact, another way, that there is a level 1 and 2. It's your baseline. And people will often say, well, this is just me. Take it or leave it.
Right.
It shows up in many ways in relationships.
I can only imagine, as you were saying that, it reminds me of the phrase turned up to 11. And some people don't know they're at 11 because that's become their new default. So 11 is really 1, maybe a 2 to them. But for people who came from that secure space, they're like, no, there are a lot of like, I hear sirens, all the noises that we've become blind to. They're like, no, those are going off. It is quite loud. How can you hear anything? But I always say this, we're our biggest blind spot. We don't realize the things that we do, how things affect us in the moment, because we always want to think that we're okay, that we're normal. I like to tell people, I was like, no, you have to remember, you're the main character of your own story. So you have to be a little bit more cognizant of your actions, what's around you, because it's like, you're not average. You're kind of creating the pace, almost, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So I do think that there's a little bit of ego involved, right? Again, like people don't want to be, and maybe there's still a little bit of stigma there. Like, of course I'm emotionally regulated. What are you talking about? Like, it's almost like an insult. It's not. Again, it's a learned skill. But I also think that it's an awareness thing. You have to be willing to look at yourself and accept the honest truth. And for some people, they don't actually have the aha moment until they've experienced feeling a 1 or 2 out of 10. Then they have a comparative. Then they're like, oh yeah, okay, I do feel it different.
I can see it. Yeah.
Right? I can see it now. So it's like, when you're too close to the problem and you're in it, you're of course you're just trying to survive.
Right.
Right? Like, how can I just get through this moment? Your rational brain for the most part is not working at peak performance. So there's all sorts of factors that go into that. So if you have friends or your partner or someone is saying to you, listen, you seem to really be on edge. Yep. Listen to that. Like, listen to that, because they're seeing something that maybe you're not able to see in the moment.
Right. And that comes back to just articulating. If you are that partner, if you are that friend who's like, maybe you are a bit tightly wound or you seem this way, it's really important to articulate in the way that, hey, we're not blaming. You have to make sure that you are also creating that safe environment or that you came from, where you're like, I could tell mom, dad, anybody around me this and not feel like I'd be attacked or shamed or pushed away. So when you create that environment for them, and then you can explain why, or here's why I think that, it helps break down those walls, that defense they might have. And it gives them just enough time to be like, you know what? You're right. Maybe there is something more to it, or I've never thought about a lot. We don't know why we do half of what we do. We don't think about it. It's just an unconscious response, like 90% of the time. But that 10% where somebody questions us, and we actually have to think, why am I doing this process? That's where the most change and the biggest discoveries lie.
Yeah.
So once again, that's something that we never really talk about. We just assume everybody's operating on the same operating system. Let's always have a translator with us because we all speak a different language to an extent, an emotional language.
I love how you phrase that. And yeah, our brains are like a little computer, like you made reference, like an operating system. Now, I'm going to shock you. You talk about how 90% of, our thoughts and our patterns are subconscious. It's higher. It's actually 95 to 97%.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
Of what we think, our emotional patterns, and then like our coping mechanism, like how to deal with situations. That is patterned into us, in the subconscious mind, and runs 97% of what we're doing in a day, which means it's not at the level of awareness. The level of awareness is 3 to 5%. So people are not even aware that they're running these computer programs over and over and over. They're just repeating patterns, right? So if something felt unsafe to them in childhood, they're going to react in the same way. This is unsafe. I'm going to pull away. I'm going to not answer. I'm going to fight. They're going to go into a survival mode because their brain is telling them this is a threat. Now, our brain isn't always right. What was once a threat to us as a child no longer presents a threat in adulthood, except our brain doesn't just automatically upgrade. We have to do the work in order to go, okay, which one of these patterns is no longer serving me? And we can, because this is learned behavior. We can unlearn it, and we can learn new patterns. So you beautifully exemplified, illustrated how this really is a computer program running in the background, and it's guiding us. Yeah.
Right. Just keeping with that theme. That's why sometimes we end up in situations where we feel outside of ourselves, or we're like, why is it this hard? It's because we're running those old operating systems and we're not taking the time to reinstall, to update that software.
Right.
And
when 30 years old, the software, right? Yeah.
Like, you're still running the original iOS. Like, let's come on,
right.
Get with it. But when we take the time and we go to therapy, when we start surrounding ourselves with a healthier group of people, when we spend a little bit of time alone and actually have time to reflect, those are many patches that keep us operating smoothly and more efficiently. You can start to see, like, oh wow, now that I'm thinking about this, yeah, this is so old. Like, this is so unpixelated. Like, I was like, you can see that the life you're living isn't, quote unquote, in HD.
Yeah, what you're doing is you're trying to protect yourself, but you're also, inhibiting yourself from fully enjoying life and all its pleasures.
And we're all about passion here. We have a passion for living, just a passion for life. Now, we're talking about upgrading these operating systems, our viewpoints, our perspective. So I think we're kind of saying that we're agreeing that you can evolve your attachment style in a sense.
It's very true. Typically, I like to say that like attracts like. So typically someone who is securely attached doesn't typically choose someone who's insecurely attached. But we do find many times that people who are insecurely attached choose other insecurely attached. So you're absolutely right. Because it's learned behavior, we can actually evolve. And then if we have a traumatic experience later in life, we're most suggestible when we're 0 to 5, but it absolutely can imprint us and sort of move us back into, another range. It's a continuum. There are very few people who fall smack into one category. What we often see is someone, for example, who is mostly securely attached, but maybe leaning anxious, which means that they may have some of the traits. So I can go over this really quickly, what the traits are of the three groups. I'm talking about sort of like on the extremes here, right? So again, most people, if we look at a bell curve, most people are sort of, usually centered towards the middle. We do have examples of people who are extreme, but it's less common, obviously. So generally someone who's anxious, preoccupied did come out of a home where they felt some sort of abandonment or perceived abandonment or emotional abandonment, right? They were invalidated, or their parents were emotionally unavailable. They were always trying to get the attention of the parents, and they couldn't. Maybe the mother had too many children in the home to take care of. The child feels like they were abandoned in some way, and they grow up. Their emotional patterns tend to be, they feel very lonely, they feel sad, they feel anxious, and love and connection is generally very important to them. So when they get to the age where they start with romantic relationships, these are the folks who generally move at lightning speed, and they want to they're craving it, right? It's so important. They want to get into a relationship very, very quick, and they want to form that bond. These people are generally, they can be very warm, very friendly, but they do tend to overshare. This is a strategy.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Joshua, if you've ever met someone and in the first hour, you know their entire life.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was like, are we pointing at ourselves? A little bit. I was like, that was definitely me at a point in time.
Okay, fair. So, by the way, I want to make mention that attachment styles are not gendered. So it's not like men fit here and women fit there and whatever. No, it just has to do with the patterns that you received from childhood, right? So typically the types of behaviors that we see from someone who's anxious, preoccupied in a relationship is they tend to be viewed as needy. They don't love the term. We all have needs. They want to spend a lot of time with their partner. They need a lot of reassurance, validation, attention. They tend to be a bit clingy. If they feel their partner pulling away, they will fight. They will fight to get your attention. They will fight for that relationship because the idea of being abandoned by a romantic partner just stabs them in a wound that's already very, very present for them. The I will be abandoned.
Yeah.
Right? It makes sense. I mean, we all have more than one core wound. The big one for the anxious preoccupied is I will be abandoned, but other core wounds that we find often within that group is I will be unloved, or I am unlikable, I will be alone, I will be excluded. So these are people who generally never learned how to self-soothe in childhood. And so they will surround themselves with large groups of people because they're highly reliant on other people to try to regulate their nervous system.
Okay, yeah.
And so we find these groups of people, like a very typical profession for this type of person would be a teacher. They love to be around groups of people. They've got large social groups. They're friends with everyone. The idea of being alone for them is like torture.
No, I can hear that loud. And I would have never thought about teacher, but you have a built-in entourage, or so to speak, in your class, and you usually have multiple classes. So you're always surrounded by people, whether it's peers, other the students. So I think that's really interesting to bring up.
Yeah. So if you have a core wound, or you have an emotional pattern where you often feel lonely, it's hard to feel lonely when you're surrounded by, an entire class of grade 2 students.
Because I was like, they are really dependent, and you're right. I was like, not needy, but I was like, they're at that age where they just love socializing. They're so eager for knowledge and attention as well. That's something you're kind of sharing and bonding over.
Yeah. So the human mind just always tries to get our needs met. That's the subconscious mind. Not necessarily in the best way. It doesn't mean that it doesn't always take us in the best direction, but it is trying to get our needs met. So if you're feeling lonely, you can see why they would gravitate towards, large groups and so forth. So that's the anxious preoccupied. Now, on the other side of the extreme is the dismissive avoidance, and it's more or less the opposite of the anxious preoccupied. So generally speaking, these people came out of homes where they felt high degree of neglect, emotional neglect, criticism. They were left alone a lot. There was not a lot of space for their emotions. Like, maybe they came from a home that was very strict, or, from a high demand religion, maybe something like that, where there wasn't a lot of room for them to be themselves, to ask for help. It was very prescriptive. And these children learn that, okay, I have emotions. No one's going to help me. Right? It could have been, multiple examples of, a little boy going to his mom crying, and the mother said, stop crying, or I'll give you something to cry about.
Right. Yeah.
Very invalidating. The child learns right then and there, there's no place for me to be sad. I'm going to push it down. I'm not going to ask for my mother for help anymore, because why bother? She's not going to help me. And I have me, myself, and I'm just going to learn how to deal with it on my own. And that's what these children do. And they develop into adults who are hyper independent, overly self-reliant. They're very sensitive to criticism. They're concerned about, that these are the ones who are extremely slow in committing to relationships. It's very difficult for them to allow someone into their emotional space.
Yeah.
They themselves are so disconnected from their own emotion, and they had to learn to deal with their own emotions. So they have this pattern that, I don't even know what the hell I'm feeling. You want me to be concerned about your feeling? No one ever helped me with my feelings. So
Yeah.
you want me to, what do you want me to do? The fact that you're feeling sad, like there's no modeling for them. Like their response is like, I don't know, you're sad, go deal with it. Like
Right.
you really don't know.
It's so funny because you mentioned earlier that these attachment styles aren't gendered, but in a way I feel like, well, sometimes they are a little preconditioned because not just from like mothers, but fathers too. Young boys are always, they're like, you're crying. They're like, suck it up, put some dirt on it, or I will give you something to cry about.
Yeah.
Then teaches them, hey, there's no place for my emotion. Once again, I have to deal with it. And so then you end up with these young adult men or men from 18 to early 30s who are going out trying to date, trying to find partners. But they're like, I feel like I don't know if you like me, or you don't talk to me. We're having trouble connecting. Well, yeah, because you grew up in an environment where expressing your feelings wasn't an option, or you just had to say, hey, this is what it is, and endure. And so when you're met with somebody who's like, well, let's talk this out, or I have these big feelings, I feel like as a guy who's been there, I understand you're not happy. This sucks, but they'll still have to be.
True. It's true. We see all the time. We see it all the time. The anxious female and the dismissive man. The anxious female wants to talk about the problem, and the dismissive man is running away. That seems to be a trope that we see, but I want you to know that there are plenty of women who are dismissive. There are plenty of men who are anxious, but you are correct. I believe that the way in which boys and girls are socialized, although it's changing a bit in modern days, it does impact us. It does, because you're learning at that age what is acceptable and what isn't.
Mhm.
So the dismissive avoidant, the name is pretty apt here, right? They will avoid things that trigger their fears around intimacy, getting too emotionally close with someone. And so it will be difficult for them to engage in that conversation that, has emotional depth. They have, this belief that relationships should be harmonious, and I'll take care of my needs and you take care of your needs. That's what they learned, right? You could sort of see that pattern. They're very protective of their freedom, their independence. They're often seen as secretive.
Well, that's a good descriptor.
They're often seen as secretive, but it's because, as I mentioned earlier, so their core wound is a shame wound, right? Which is, I am defective. And if you ask dismissive men, for example, they'll be like, what are you talking about? It's deep in the subconscious. If you get too close to me, you will also see that I'm defective, and you will reject me in the same way that my parents did.
That is a really good point I guess we do talk about it. So we're talking about it now, and you do hear this, but I was like, adults are just really big kids. They're just kids who have had a lot more baggage to carry, life to live. So it makes sense that we supplement a partner for a mother or a father. We all end up, it feels like, dating some version of one of our parents, for better or worse.
Do you want to know why that happened?
Yes. I was like, I think I have an idea, but let's see if we're on the same wavelength.
So people ask me all the time, like, if I'm a woman, do I end up falling in love with my father or vice versa? Not exactly. What you're actually doing is your subconscious mind is attracted to what's familiar. So it's a dynamic, it's a pattern that you're already familiar with. And so you end up gravitating towards what is familiar. And in some way, people are trying to play out a dynamic that they once had with a caregiver and give it a different ending. although we know that it generally doesn't have a different ending. So this is why it's so important to do the work in the subconscious, because your subconscious is not worried about what's best for you. It just draws you to what's familiar. So yes, the dynamics that you had in your household, you generally will recreate some or part of that in a romantic relationship. And the reason is, again, when you were a child and you were so dependent on your caregiver, you afforded them all of your trust. This person had your survival in their hands. When a child from 0 to 5, they cannot survive without their parents. So that trust is implicit, right? And then as we grow into adults and we build some level of autonomy, if we make a decision to enter into a romantic relationship, generally that person becomes the one that's closest to us, mirroring the relationship we once had, meaning, my romantic partner, I now depend on them as well. I now afford them the greatest deal of trust, in relation to anyone else in my life. Like I trust them more than just, my regular friends, for example. I have a level of intimacy with them, like emotional intimacy that I once would have had with my caregiver. So that's the closest thing in adulthood that we get to recreating that pattern that we had in childhood. So the flip side is that your partner can trigger you in ways that like, your friend can tell you something and you'll be like, whatever. Your partner says it and it triggers you.
Yeah. Forming that connection right there just should be sending you, I can see them right there through the screens, little light bulbs going up on everybody's head, because the baggage that we haven't worked through just gets recycled. We have the old saying, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Well, it's like, we all go to a restaurant, we have an order because it's familiar, it's routine. Or you go to a new restaurant, you're like, I know I like this here, I'll probably like it here too. It's that same phenomenon that if you really start to look at it, it pops up in so many different parts of your life.
Yeah, I totally agree. Our mind is very, very interesting in that way, right? Our mind is focused on survival.
Yeah.
Right? It's risk averse to some degree. So it's just taking you down back to what's familiar. I'll finish out the whole definitions of the three because we still have one category left, which is called the fearful avoidance, which is somewhere in the middle of this continuum. Now, the fearful avoidant used to also be called disorganized attachment, which is a pretty good name for it. Essentially, the fearful avoidance carries some traits of the dismissive avoidance and some traits of the anxious preoccupied, which means that they're a person who experiences high degree of anxiety and high degree of avoidance, which is hard, really hard. And the reason that this actually comes out is because it's usually when a child experiences abuse in the home. And when a young child experiences, wanting the love and the comfort and safety from their primary caregiver, being drawn to that for that person, for that closeness, but that person is also the one harming them. So it could be psychologically, it could be emotionally, physically, it could be sexually, it could be all of the above. And the child then forms an attachment bond in a disorganized way. They yearn for the closeness of that person because they love their caregiver. They're dependent on their caregiver for survival, but they also really fear them because that caregiver is harming them. And so what this translates into in adulthood, we often call this person the hot and cold partner. 1 minute they're hot, the next minute they pull back. The next minute, come back, I want a little bit of intimacy. You're getting too close, take a step back. So there's a high degree of emotional volatility with these people because they really do want closeness, but they're very fearful of intimacy.
I can't speak for the people who are in the secure boat because I'm honest enough with myself to know that I've probably been ping-ponging my way through the insecure attachment styles, which is, like you said, it's a gradient. You slide on it. Most of life, nothing's ever just one thing. You always have a little bit of everything in you. But you're right. so often people who find themselves being single for an extended period of time start to lose some of those mechanisms to interact with people on that romantic level because they're used to their autonomy. So when you're in a situation where you're like, I would love acceptance, I want human interaction or that physical touch, but at the same time, I don't want to give up my autonomy. It's really hard, and you do have that hot and cold moment where, or we call it the cat energy, where it's like be present. I'm gonna paw at you for a little bit, but then you also go away. Don't touch me.
Yeah, which is in the dating world translates into, most often we see this, like, not to transition the dating apps, but these would be people who breadcrumb. So they'll drop, right? They'll drop like little, like, hey babe, how's it going? Hi gorgeous, little good morning, because they're looking for little hits of attention and validation.
Right.
But that's all they need. They don't really want to have a real conversation. They don't really want to get together and get to know you. They're just, they need little hits of dopamine because, they need to feel some level of closeness to people, but they don't really want anything that's going to spark that level of fear, which would be true intimacy, depth, any commitment. So we tend to see that behavior a lot.
And it's so funny that you talked about breadcrumbing, because I don't think I would have made the correlation had you not. So I feel like there's a connection between people who breadcrumb to people who quote unquote string people along. I don't know if people intentionally always string people along, because I think it really does have to do with their attachment style. They're afraid of the rejection, but they're afraid of hurting somebody or saying how they really feel because they don't know what that response is going to be. So it's very uncertain for them. They give a little bit here and then they give a little bit more. But if they're not feeling it, you're also afraid to withdraw to a certain extent, because they're like, will I ever get this again? Because when you're afraid of, will I be loved? You're like, this may be a lot for me right now, but if I miss this opportunity, will I get another one? I think I don't think people really think about that. And because that just kind of folded together for me for some reason.
Yeah. So I would say that most people don't really take the time to think about why they do most things. Like it goes back to the whole computer program. It feels good in the moment. I'll send a text out to a few people and see who responds. And like, they're not really saying, oh, I'm doing this because I feel like I need a little attention in the moment. Like, people are not necessarily that consciously aware. But I do want to make a distinction because, you talk about intent, and that is important. Even when we're talking about the dismissive avoidance, and I think the dismissive avoidant gets really demonized on the internet as like a total jerk or total this, and men and women, right? Oh, I would never date another dismissive avoidant. She was awful. I've seen it all. I do believe that I've seen another attachment specialist actually create subcategories to this, and I thought it was interesting. I would never pass it off as my own work, but I will say this comes from Adam Lane. He's also an attachment specialist. He's very good at his work. He was talking about how he sees that within the dismissive avoiding category, that there's two categories. One he calls ethical and the other manipulative. And so there are people who will tell you straight up, listen, I'm not looking for an emotional connection, but if you just want to hang out once in a while, like, they're sort of telling you, don't get too close, I'll hurt you. They're telling you straight up.
Yeah.
Whether you listen or not, that's your thing, right? But there are others who are manipulative, right? In that they understand their behavior and they're doing it anyways because they're trying to get their own needs met at the possible expense of someone else. The intent does matter. The same goes for the anxious, preoccupied. There's a subset of this group where they are very nurturing. Some people are smothering in how much love they want to give you.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, to be on the receiving end feels suffocating, but that person has a good heart. Like, they're spewing love. And you're like, okay, you're a little too much for me, but
the little cork in it, just like an even flow, just not a big gust all at once. No,
Right, but you can tell that it's coming from a good place, right? Whereas there's another cohort of anxious preoccupied who are toxic in their approach, also manipulative, right? And so, I think intent really does matter. And I think that once you start to dive into attachment styles and understand your own behavior and your own coping mechanisms, as Maya Angelou says, once you know better, do better. So it really is that simple. Once you figure out, okay, why am I so emotionally volatile? Why do I have all of these coping behaviors? Which coping behaviors, again, like we're talking about things like, when uncomfortable feelings come up, how you deal with that. So, a lot of people will choose to numb out, right? And you numb out in so many different ways. You could be using alcohol, you could be using drugs, you can be using sex. That's a very popular one. You can watch Netflix all weekend. You can totally isolate yourself for 3 weeks. Like people numb out, you can overeat, you can gamble. Like I could go on and on, right?
Yeah.
So we use these behaviors to distract us, pull us away from what's uncomfortable because we don't want to deal with it. And oftentimes these behaviors are what cause problems in our life in general, in our romantic lives.
Yeah.
And so really it's so important to actually look at, okay, where are my core wounds, right? And once you can identify your core wounds, we can work with that. And so that your thought patterns change, your emotional patterns change, you calm down, you have less of a need to numb out, right? And then you can reach that higher level of living the quality of life that you want.
Right. It's so funny in this age of social media that we live in, my generation more maybe than yours, but sorry, and this is a question I've asked on the show. I think we even did a whole episode on it, is we love toxicity. I was like, no matter where I feel like where you fall at, it's a question I love asking to my guests, just to my friends too, is I was like, what's the toxic trait that you're attracted to? Because even though you might not face it or present it, there's usually one that comes to mind that we like.
So you know what that's about?
Let's break it down.
Have you heard of shadow work?
Yeah. Yes. That's another thing that's becoming more popular. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what it is. Essentially, we're often attraction's a science. Mm-hmm. So they've studied this at length. So part of what we're attracted to in a potential mate or partner is repressed traits. So, as a young girl, I think I mentioned that, there was no space for me to be angry. Angry was not tolerated in my home. So I had to, even if I was angry, I had to pretend like I was happy and put a smile on my face. And so when someone can express anger in a healthy way, I'm really attracted to that. Because I had to repress it for a long time. And for me, it's also like someone who is, and it's interesting because most people would be surprised by this, but I do enjoy someone who is a little bit dominant, who can express anger when necessary, who is highly protective, who has a very strong protective instinct.
Right.
And that's because I didn't feel protected when I was young. Now, as a grown woman, I clearly don't need, a man, for example, to help me in this world. I'm more than capable.
Well, yeah.
But it's a feeling, mm-hmm. right? It's something that you desire. So, a lot of this work is about authenticity and like dropping the shame that we have around things. So I happen to like men who are a little bit more dominant, very protective. Okay, that's not a popular thing to say in today's modern, dating world, because every woman has to be, a modern woman. So, but you have to be true to yourself.
Yeah. I actually think that's less of a hot take than you think, because true in this current, and I'm ready for it. I was like, I got on my head, guys, in the comments. If you want to go ahead, bash me, go ahead, give it your best shot. But I think that's less of a hot take than you think, because as much as you have your girl boss right now or your self-sufficient woman, there's always the double standard that yes, you can do it and a man shouldn't have to do it. But I've never really seen somebody genuinely upset when they are with a man, for those who are in the heteronormative culture, who's with a man who actually acts like a man. I was like, men get a lot of guff for it nowadays, toxic, but you love it. I was like, once again, it goes back to that thing. It's toxic, quote unquote, but you love that aspect because, and it's the same for a man is we give a lot of guff that we're being softened, but we love when a woman embraces us and has that a strong maternal instinct where everybody's so eager to throw out toxic or problematic. Are these things really problematic or just a little bit inconvenient at times?
I think discourse is good. I think we take the discourse too far at times. The pendulum swings a little too far. I think I mentioned earlier in our discussion, I've raised two men. They're 18 and 20. They're both away at university. The phrase toxic masculinity, it puts a chill down my spine. Like, What the hell does that even mean?
Right.
And how do we get to decide what's toxic and what's not? And, I don't like the phrase. And I don't like, some of the narrative that's going around in terms of, accepting modern world dating. Like, I think that we all have to do what feels comfortable for us.
Yeah.
Right? As people.
100%. It's really hard to close Pandora's box, to rewind time, but I love that it was for such a long time. It was the era of toxic masculinity, but now you have positive masculinity being brought into a lot of conversations, relationships around sex, around just life matters. It sounds like, okay, this is the scale finally tipping back to even, to nil. And it is, because that same thing that you think may be overprotective or limiting in a partner, you think is amazing in a father and a parent. And so, but it's about perspective. We don't think too far into the future because some of us are in survival mode. So we only think about the here and now, what's in front of us. But then you're like, I don't need this. Like, I can open my own door. Cool. But when you have a little daughter or when you have a son and you're like, they can't open a door for them, or they need the protecting. You're like, this is amazing. So it's just so funny that the cycle, the next generation after us will probably have the same conversation, and the generation after that. But like you said, I think it's just, as long as the scales come back to zero, then that's really where things get to become okay, because you don't want to, we see it, I don't know if you're on TikTok, we haven't quite come back to zero and we overcorrected because now you have those gym videos where you see a woman like lifting more than like they can do without a spotter. They're like, hey, can I get help? Or like, they're like, sorry. I was like, I'm not going to get canceled. I'm not going to be like the bad. Well, look what we've done. We've now put such a divide amongst our society that it makes it hard. Or I was like, we're essentially shifting our attachments again, because what you thought like your behavior was so secure and like this was a healthy relationship. Well, now you're like, I was like, we're shifting people and not in a positive direction. I feel like sometimes that's why I was like, I'm not the hugest fan of social media, because I think more times than not, I don't think it's really doing us a service. It's doing it as a disservice.
I agree. And I think that's well said. When I started doing this work years ago, I made a promise to myself that I would try to be as authentic and honest as I could be with myself and with others. Social media doesn't really fit into that. I don't think that it's a very honest platform. I don't think, I think we see lots of things that are fake. That doesn't really interest me. Although I will tell you that my adult children showed me how to use TikTok. So my company is on TikTok. I mean, so, putting it out there. But yeah, we often ascribe, language to things like, again, toxic masculinity. And, the word of the day is narcissist, and everyone has trauma and this and that. And so we tend to overuse terms, and then they get watered down to what they actually meant. Trauma is really something that is outside. It's an event that is outside of our normal living structures, right? So trauma doesn't happen to us. We experience traumatic events. And then it's how we process the trauma that either stays with us or, and how it stays with us and affects us. But, I was in Starbucks the other day and a young girl got her coffee and I think it was ordered wrong or whatever. And she's like, "But I'm so traumatized." And I was like, "Oh gosh."
I was like, did you have a deathly allergy? Because that might be traumatic, but I was like,
patronizing the word. Like,
yes.
Come on. Real, right? But it's not that.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think we're ascribing words and language to things that are just a little bit too exaggerated. And I believe that regardless of what the trends are, because you and I both know 1 week it's this and the next week it's that.
Yes.
Just be yourself. So, if you're a strong, confident person and some person happens to think that, your version of masculinity is toxic, let them think that. Be yourself.
You're not for everybody and everybody's not for you. That's
all the time.
our truth that some people have to learn.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
So, I was going to say this is such a good discussion.
I really did want to spend some time talking about these attachment styles and how it could relate to sexual preferences. But guys, I think that just might have to be a part 2 episode. Now, if you can get this video to at least 100 likes, I think we could make a part 2 happen. I think that's doable, but only if we hit 100 likes. But before we get out of here, we have to make sure that we give you the time, the space, the opportunity to say thank you. And for other people who are like, you know what, I have more questions about my attachment style. What is my attachment style? And how is that showing up in my day-to-day? Where can they find you?
Yeah, thank you for that. So my company is called Securely Loved. Our website is Securely Loved. We are across social media, again, thanks to my children who have modernized me. Instagram and TikTok, securely_love. Also, one of the best ways to get started in terms of understanding your own attachment style, if you go to my website, there's a little button that says attachment quiz. It's free. It's just for you. It doesn't come to me. I don't get the results. You answer a couple of questions and then it'll give you an idea of where you fall on the attachment scale. So that's a good piece of awareness as a starting point. And myself and the other practitioners that I work with, because we're a group of relationship and attachment trauma practitioners. So you can book a free 20-minute consult with me or with any of the other practitioners that I work with. And we can take it from there too if there's some, specific issues or core wounds that you want to dive into.
Alrighty, guys. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. Be sure to like this video, share it with a friend or somebody who may be having trouble connecting not just with others, but themselves as well, because maybe they just aren't understanding their attachment style and what they really need, what they're missing, what their core trauma might be. Just take a minute to do that. It's super easy. It's just one click right in the bottom of your screen. I'm going to make sure that I leave all of her information down in the description. So in case you couldn't get it, you can just follow the link and take your attachment quiz, because it's also, if nothing else, a great conversation piece at your next date night. And until next week, I will see all you amazing bachelors and bachelorettes or partnered people on the next episode of the Not So Bad Bachelor Pad.